Hi again then guys, and welcome to the 31st pick out of my top 50 favourite vehicles in the world for 2018, and we're once again returning to the motorbike world. As I said from the outset of the series, I wasn't planning to feature that many motorbikes in this series overall, 5 of them I think it was, and this is definitely one which has always been one of my favourites. A lot of the cars on this list have been, but as far as bikes, I tend to have less favourites than I do with cars, but the ones which I love, I really do love. And this one for me is almost like the motorbike equivalent of something like the Renault Espace F1 nostalgia that I have thanks to Gran Turismo 2. Because when I was playing Gran Turismo 2, I was also playing around the same time a game called Ducati World Racing. And that is still one of the best motorcycle racing games I've ever played. It's probably my second favourite, only to Tourist Trophy, which gives you some idea of how good I think it is. There are tons of bikes on that game. It's almost like the Ferrari challenge of bike games, where it specialises in one manufacturer and gives you a ton of bikes from that company. And back then when I was a kid, I was about 6 or 7, cars that were bright yellow or bright green or bright orange really stood out to me. And as stupidly basic as that is, I would immediately like those vehicles. And then, of course, when you actually drive them or ride them, that would either be solidified or I'd be disappointed. And, of course, part of the fact that the Renault Espace F1 stood out so much, or part of the reason, is because it was gold. Of course it stood out. Typical kid, give it shiny stuff and it likes it. So, a bit stereotypical, but that was the way it worked for me. And with this Ducati, I mean, apart from the fact that yellow is my favourite colour anyway, which helps a lot, of course, this one immediately stood out in a sea of red and occasional black bikes. You've got this bright yellow one with white on the pillion, and it just looks so cool to me. But then the great thing about the Ducati 748, in particular the SP, which, for those who are unfamiliar with the 748 range or with Ducati in general, this is like the more hardcore version. You've got the 748, the 748S, I think there's a 748S, a 748SP, and there's the SPS as well, which is even more hardcore, but that one's basically just a race bike for the road, so I don't quite like it that hardcore, whereas this one is kind of like the Ducati equivalent of a Gallardo Superleggera for Lamborghini, that kind of thing. Now, by today's standards, this bike doesn't have amazing specs. The top speed is about 150 miles per hour, which doesn't even sound that fast for a superbike these days, but this has so much less power, and quite a bit more weight than you might expect a bike with a 748cc could have. It weighs around 200 kilos, but the performance is still fantastic. 0 to 60, of course, is around the low 3-second range, so it's not exactly slow, of course. And one of the things that I've always loved, not just when it comes to Ducati, but with any bike, because I will often prefer a smaller engine bike in the range to the big ones, which seems like a strange thing, given many of my favourite vehicles are big, powerful ones. But the reason why I love those is because a bike which is around 6 to, say, 700cc or 750, they're usually much more manoeuvrable than something with, say, a 900 or a 1000 or a 1200, because they're great in a straight line, of course, but it's not all about straight line performance when it comes to most of the bikes that I like. I like a bike that has good all-round ability, and that's just really fun through corners as well, and this bike is really the pinnacle of that when it comes to Ducatis, arguably even more fun through corners than its bigger brother, the very similarly styled but different coloured 900 series, with the 916, the 996, the 998, more powerful and certainly quicker in a straight line, but not necessarily quite as good through corners. And I'm sure there are people who would disagree with that. I haven't ridden the bikes, but from what I've ascertained, I've heard and read that this bike is more nimble, which makes sense, because the thing which occurs with a motorbike, a superbike especially, is that when you compare a bike with a really big engine, even a sport bike, something like a Ninja 12R or a BMW S1000RR or something like that, you will often not be as much quicker around a circuit as you might expect when compared to a bike with a much, much smaller engine, say like a 250 even, because you can push a less powerful bike with a smaller engine much, much harder than you can a big, really powerful bike with around, say, 180, 200 horsepower. So that's kind of the case for me with the 748SP. It's got much more chuckability. I mean, don't literally try and do that, but you know what I mean. It's more of a cornering focus machine than a straight line one. Plus, I've always loved the look, as I alluded to in my review of the 998R in the Ride game review series. This is a gorgeous bike, I think. This entire generation of 90s Ducati superbikes with both the 700 and 900s, which is essentially the same bike but in a different colour, visually speaking, I think they look perfect. They've aged so well. It's a gorgeous looking bike, very simple design. It doesn't need all cluttered aero or intakes all over the place or some kind of livery. I mean, it has a livery, but it's a fairly basic one, but it's a memorable one as well. The yellow and white stands out. It looks fantastic. And for me, this has been one of those vehicles, funnily enough, which a lot longer than most of the cars on this list, has been one of my favourites. As I said, when I was about 6 years old, I fell in love with the bike, and now I still do. That doesn't happen often for me, but it certainly has with this one. Definitely deserves to be high. I actually debated about putting it even higher, but ultimately decided to have it here, and not quite the midway point, but thereabouts. So yeah, I adore the 748 SP, easily my favourite Ducati ever, definitely one of my dream bikes as well, and this is one of those vehicles which I would definitely buy if I had that kind of cash to spend on a toy, basically. So overall, that's it for this pick. Of course, you can check out others in my top 50 favourites list by clicking through at the end. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.